Maxwell Donovan gave 40 years of his life to the bank, building wealth, stability, and a legacy meant to protect his family. But on the night of his retirement party, his wife and children handed him divorce papers, demanded his fortune, and mocked the very life he sacrificed for them. They thought he was powerless. What they didn't know was that he had been planning for this moment for 15 years. Have you ever faced betrayal from the people you trusted most? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might remind someone that patience and integrity are the strongest forms of justice. My name is Maxwell Donovan. I'm 65 years old, and this is the story of how my own family tried to take everything from me, and how I made sure they lost it all instead. The ballroom at Riverside Plaza shimmered under soft golden lights, filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the low hum of admiration directed toward Maxwell Donovan. After 40 years at Portland National Bank, his colleagues and former associates had gathered to honor the man they called a cornerstone of the institution. Applause erupted again as the division head raised his glass, his voice booming over the microphone. To Maxwell Donovan, whose steady hand guided our investment department through 4 recessions and countless market crashes. We'd still be using calculators and paper ledgers if not for your technological vision. The room echoed with cheers, but Maxwell's smile remained polite, controlled. On the surface, he looked like a man content with his legacy, yet his attention kept drifting toward the reserved family table near the front. Vivian sat there with her usual elegance, her silver blonde hair perfectly styled, her designer dress draping her like a queen at court. But Maxwell noticed the calculated way she kept glancing toward their children, Natalie and Preston. Natalie, 38 and every inch her mother's daughter, had the same sharp features and cool ambition. Her phone rested discreetly on the table, her thumb poised over it as if ready to capture something important. Preston, 35, slouched in his chair, wearing a smirk that never reached his eyes. He had Maxwell's sturdy build, but none of his discipline. Something about the way Natalie and Preston exchanged quick, secretive glances, their subtle nods, set Maxwell's instincts on edge. As the speeches ended and the guests began to mingle, Maxwell excused himself politely and made his way to the family table. Vivian greeted him with a smile that seemed just a touch too bright. She placed a delicate hand on his arm, her grip firm but performative. "Congratulations, darling," she said warmly. "We're so proud of you." Her tone was sweet, but her eyes glittered with something else entirely. "Congratulations, Dad," Preston added, his voice thick with something Maxwell couldn't immediately place. Nervousness? Excitement? It was hard to tell. "We have a special surprise for you," Vivian said, her smile widening. Natalie leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable, though there was a flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. Vivian reached into her expensive designer purse and, with carefully manicured fingers, pulled out a thick manila envelope. She slid it across the table toward Maxwell. "A little retirement gift," she said. Maxwell stared at the envelope for a moment, his expression neutral, though a sinking feeling settled in his chest. He knew, deep down, that this was no gift. "What's this?" he asked, his voice calm, betraying none of the tension coiling in his gut. "Open it," Natalie urged, her phone now angled toward him, recording discreetly. Maxwell opened the envelope with deliberate care. Inside were neatly organized legal documents, divorce papers, asset transfer agreements, and pension dispersal authorizations. Every page required his signature. Preston leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms with a smug look. "We thought we'd make this easy for you," he said. "The signature and you can begin your new life unburdened," Vivian added, her voice filled with false sympathy. Her tone was practiced, rehearsed for maximum control. "Your pension is ours," Preston said flatly, barely hiding his greed. "You get nothing." Natalie's smirk widened as she leaned forward slightly. "Congrats on 40 years of wasting your life, old man," she said, her words cutting like a blade. Maxwell stared at the documents for a long moment. His face was still, expressionless, even as rage boiled beneath the surface. 40 years of sacrifice, of building a life for these very people, and this was how they chose to thank him. Slowly, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his Mont Blanc pen, the same pen Vivian had given him for their 25th anniversary. He uncapped it carefully, the soft click loud in the sudden quiet around the table. Without a word, Maxwell signed each document with measured, deliberate precision. Natalie's phone caught every stroke of the pen, every calm movement. Vivian watched, her expression triumphant, and Preston smirked like a man already counting his inheritance. When Maxwell finished, he placed the pen neatly back into his breast pocket. He looked up at his family, his eyes steady, his voice calm. Almost too calm. "Understood," he said simply. He stood, adjusting his suit jacket as if the entire exchange meant nothing to him. "I'll clear out my office and be gone by morning." "What'd be best?" Vivian said quickly, already glancing back at her phone, scrolling through luxury vacation packages as though the matter was already settled. Maxwell gave a single nod and turned to leave. To his family, he looked like a defeated man, accepting his fate without a fight. But behind his composed exterior, his mind was already moving, every piece of his long-laid plan sliding into place. They thought they had won. They had no idea what was coming. 15 years earlier, Maxwell Donovan sat alone in his home office late at night, the soft glow of his computer screen casting long shadows across the room. Vivian was supposed to be at a charity dinner, and he had been reviewing quarterly reports for the bank when a small notification appeared on his screen. It was a backup from their shared family phone account, one he had set up years ago to sync photos and contacts. He rarely paid attention to it, but that night something made him open the archive. Within seconds, he stumbled across a series of text messages that changed everything he thought he knew about his marriage. The messages were between Vivian and Bernard Holloway, his longtime financial advisor and one of the few people Maxwell had considered a personal friend. The texts were casual at first, filled with flirtatious remarks and innuendo that quickly became explicit confirmations of a long-term affair. But what struck Maxwell harder than the betrayal of his marriage were the later messages. Bernard had written, "Once his retirement papers are signed, we'll have everything lined up. He won't even know what hit him." Vivian's reply chilled him. "Max is predictable. He'll sign anything if it's presented the right way. A few tears, a little guilt, and he'll roll over. We'll have access to his pension and the offshore accounts. Just hold tight." Maxwell stared at the screen, his pulse pounding in his ears. His first instinct was to confront Vivian immediately, to demand answers, to throw Bernard out of their lives. But years of discipline kept him still. Maxwell had not spent his youth as just another office worker. Long before his career at Portland National Bank, Maxwell had served in military intelligence. Most of his colleagues at the bank had no idea about this chapter of his life, and Vivian certainly never understood the kind of man she had married. Back then, he had been trained to observe, to wait, and to plan several steps ahead. In the field, rash decisions cost lives. Patience and strategy won wars. That night, as he sat in the dim light of his office, Maxwell decided that he would not confront Vivian or Bernard. Not yet. Confrontation would only alert them, give them time to adjust, to hide evidence, to move their schemes into deeper shadows. Instead, he would do what he had been trained to do. He would wait, he would watch, and he would prepare. Over the next several weeks, Maxwell began collecting information quietly. He carefully copied every incriminating message, every financial document Bernard sent Vivian, every scrap of digital evidence that could expose them both. He built encrypted storage drives that Vivian would never know existed. His military training came back to him with precision. Psychological strategy, digital infiltration, and the patience to construct a trap that would spring only when he was ready. Maxwell also began building his own financial safety net, one that neither Vivian nor Bernard could ever touch. He started by opening shell companies through anonymous trusts, slowly transferring portions of his income into accounts that couldn't be traced back to him. He purchased properties under these shell companies, 7 in total over the next decade, and used them as both investments and safe locations where he could disappear if necessary. Offshore accounts were created through layers of legal and financial obfuscation, hidden so deeply that even experienced auditors would struggle to connect them to him. For 15 years, Maxwell lived two lives. By day, he remained the mild-mannered banker everyone respected, the dependable husband who came home every night and never raised his voice. By night, he meticulously documented everything Vivian and Bernard did, compiling a detailed history of their affair and their growing financial schemes. Every time they grew bolder, every time they underestimated him, Maxwell quietly added another piece to his growing arsenal of evidence. He never allowed himself to slip. At family gatherings, he smiled and played the devoted husband. At work, he maintained his spotless reputation, even when Bernard clapped him on the back during business lunches, laughing and calling him old friend. Maxwell nodded and returned the smile. Inside, though, every word, every look, every plan was being filed away for the moment they finally made their move. Maxwell had learned long ago that the best victories were not won in anger. They were won with precision, with patience, with the quiet certainty that when the trap finally closed, there would be no escape. And so he waited, year after year, letting them think they were winning, letting them grow confident in their arrogance. They believed he was predictable. They believed he was soft. They had no idea they were the ones being hunted. 3 days after the retirement party, Maxwell Donovan vanished. He didn't leave a note, didn't answer calls, and didn't return home. His colleagues at Portland National Bank were baffled to discover that his entire personnel file, 40 years of service records, commendations, and internal memos had been wiped clean from the bank's system overnight. Joint accounts that once held millions were suddenly empty. Her credit cards linked to Vivian's name were declined by morning, leaving her fuming in front of a boutique cashier. To the outside world, it looked like Maxwell had simply disappeared, as though he had stepped off the map. But Maxwell was nowhere near gone. In a secure apartment across town, one of 7 properties he owned through shell companies, he sat calmly at a desk surrounded by 3 wide monitors. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, scanning lines of code and financial reports as they updated in real time. On one screen, a live feed showed Vivian pacing their kitchen, shouting into her phone. On another, Preston sat in his car, frantically texting. Natalie appeared on a third monitor, standing in her office, her expression tight as she spoke into a headset. Vivian was the first to panic. Maxwell watched as she logged into their joint accounts repeatedly, trying to move what she assumed was still there. Every attempt ended with an error message. She threw her phone across the counter in frustration, then grabbed it again to call Bernard Holloway. Bernard's face flashed briefly on Maxwell's screen. His secure system intercepted video calls just as easily as financial data. "This can't be happening," Vivian hissed. "You said everything was secure." Bernard's response was tense. It was, unless he planned this. Vivian shook her head, unwilling to believe Maxwell could outthink them. Preston's reaction was less composed. He called former colleagues at the bank trying to access his father's accounts through back channels, but the files Preston requested no longer existed. Maxwell had erased himself from the system in a single night, leaving nothing for Preston to exploit. Preston slammed his hand against the steering wheel, cursing loudly as Maxwell watched quietly from miles away. Natalie tried a different approach. She reached out to her legal contacts, leaning on favors she had accumulated over the years, but every search request she made was met with digital dead ends. Every attempt to trace Maxwell's new financial patterns was blocked by sophisticated security protocols, the kind only someone with years of intelligence experience could design. Natalie's jaw tightened as she realized she was hitting walls she couldn't explain. Maxwell leaned back slightly, a thin smile touching his lips. Their confusion was expected. Their panic was the first stage of what he had planned for years. It was time to begin the second. He opened a secured folder on his primary computer labeled simply, "Checkmate." Inside were hundreds of files, each meticulously prepared. The first strikes were simple but devastating. With a few keystrokes, Maxwell composed an anonymous email to federal authorities containing detailed evidence of Bernard Holloway's financial fraud, false client accounts, misappropriated investments, and offshore laundering. Bernard's signature appeared on every falsified document. The second strike targeted Preston. Maxwell attached files documenting Preston's embezzlement scheme, years of siphoning company funds to pay off gambling debts, and sent them directly to Preston's employer with a polite unsigned note. "Thought you'd want to see this before regulators do." The final strike of the day went to the State Bar Association. Maxwell uploaded carefully compiled case files proving Natalie had buried exculpatory evidence in multiple high-profile trials, violating ethical codes to secure convictions. Every document was time-stamped and cross-referenced, impossible to dismiss as fabrication. Maxwell pressed send on all 3 messages, his expression calm. There was no rush of anger, no satisfaction shouted aloud. This was not about rage. This was about precision. As he watched his monitors, waiting for the first cracks to appear in their carefully constructed lives, he whispered to himself, "Checkmate begins." The first cracks appeared within 24 hours. Bernard Holloway's office was swarmed by federal auditors before lunch. His secretary whispered to reporters camped outside that the Securities and Exchange Commission had launched an immediate investigation into fraudulent client accounts. Bernard, once smug and untouchable, was photographed leaving his office pale and sweating, refusing to answer shouted questions from journalists. By that evening, Preston's employer had suspended him pending investigation. His company issued a formal statement citing serious financial discrepancies in their accounting department, directly tied to Preston's authorization codes. Preston, usually boastful and carefree, now sat in his car outside the company building, staring blankly at the suspension notice in his hands. His phone buzzed non-stop with messages from creditors who had suddenly grown impatient now that word of his suspension was circulating. Natalie's humiliation came next. Early the following morning, she was summoned to an emergency bar committee hearing. Someone had submitted a sealed package to the state bar containing case files and court transcripts documenting her deliberate suppression of exculpatory evidence in 3 high-profile editors. The bar president himself demanded answers, as Natalie stood in front of a panel of stern-faced colleagues. Her arguments were cut short when they presented printed emails she thought she had deleted years ago. Vivian's own blow was quieter but no less devastating. She sat in her kitchen, staring at a notice from the bank informing her that their family home, the same home she bragged about owning outright for years, had a second mortgage she knew nothing about. Payments were already 3 months overdue. Her hands trembled as she read it over and over, unwilling to believe Maxwell had orchestrated this level of deception under her nose. By late afternoon, all 3 of them gathered in Vivian's living room. The air was thick with panic and anger. Natalie paced back and forth, heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood. "This is Maxwell's doing," she snapped. "He planned this for years. Who else could have coordinated all of this so perfectly?" Preston sat hunched on the sofa, running his hands through his hair, his usually cocky demeanor replaced with raw frustration. "This is insane. He's a banker, not some criminal mastermind. Maybe it's a coincidence." Vivian shot him a glare. "Maxwell doesn't have the intelligence for this. He's predictable. He's always been predictable." Her voice was strained, as though she was trying to convince herself more than anyone else. Natalie stopped pacing, fixing her mother with an incredulous stare. "Really, Mother, the man who ran the bank's investment division through 4 recessions just suddenly became incompetent? He's been playing us all along, and you know it." Before Vivian could respond, the doorbell rang. The 3 exchanged uneasy glances before Preston reluctantly stood to answer it. A courier stood on the porch, holding a single white envelope. Preston signed for it and handed it to Vivian, who opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a single handwritten note in Maxwell's neat script. It read, "Chess has always been about anticipating your opponent's moves. You've been playing checkers your entire lives. The game has just begun." A photograph slipped from the envelope onto the coffee table. Vivian froze when she saw it. It was an old picture of her and Bernard Holloway in an intimate embrace, dated 15 years earlier. The night of her and Maxwell's 25th anniversary. Natalie picked up the photo, her face tightening with disgust. Preston let out a low whistle. Vivian said nothing. She simply sat back, pale and silent, as the reality settled over her. Maxwell had been watching them for a very long time, and this was only the beginning. Vivian Donovan sat stiffly in a leather chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as Raymond Donovan studied her from behind his desk. His office overlooked the Portland shipyards, a stark contrast to the elegant boardrooms she was used to. Raymond, at 60, still carried the commanding presence of a man who had spent decades in military operations. His sharp eyes remained fixed on her, unblinking, as if he were dissecting every word before she even spoke it. "Please, Raymond," Vivian said, her voice cracking slightly despite her attempt to remain composed. "I know you and Maxwell haven't spoken in years, but you have to help me find him. Our accounts are frozen. Our reputations are being torn apart, and he's vanished completely. He's your brother. Don't you care what's happening to him?" Raymond leaned back slowly, folding his arms across his chest. His laugh was low, humorless. "Don't pretend you're worried about him, Vivian. You're worried about yourself." Vivian flinched at the bluntness but pressed on. "You don't understand. He's not capable of this. Maxwell's always been predictable." "That's where you're wrong," Raymond interrupted sharply, leaning forward. "Do you even know why we stopped speaking? 15 years ago, Maxwell came to me for advice. He had discovered your affair with Bernard Holloway. I told him to divorce you immediately, to walk away and never look back. But he didn't." Vivian's face went pale. "He knew?" Raymond nodded slowly. He knew everything. And do you know what he said to me? He told me he loved you too much to let go. He thought you'd eventually choose him. So I kept my distance, unwilling to watch my brother be played for a fool. But Maxwell? He isn't the man you think he is. My brother is patient, calculating. In the military, we called him the strategist. He could plan 5 years ahead while the rest of us were still figuring out the next 5 minutes. You never stood a chance against him. Vivian sat frozen, her mouth slightly open as Raymond stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "You never knew who you were married to, Vivian," he said flatly. "And now you're learning the hard way." That same evening, Bernard Holloway sat nervously in his luxury condo, pouring himself another glass of whiskey. His hands shook as he stared at the stack of unopened letters from regulators piling up on his kitchen counter. When the sound of footsteps echoed from his living room, he spun around, nearly dropping his glass. Maxwell Donovan stood calmly near the window, hands folded behind his back, his expression unreadable. Bernard's face drained of color. "How did you get in here?" he asked, his voice trembling. "The same way I've been getting into your accounts, your emails, and your offshore holdings in the Caymans," Maxwell replied evenly. "You should have chosen a better password than Vivian's birthday." Bernard swallowed hard, trying to regain control. "What do you want, Maxwell?" Maxwell moved closer, placing a small recorder on the coffee table. He pressed a button, and Bernard's own voice filled the room. Conversations with Vivian, detailed discussions about siphoning funds and securing Maxwell's pension once the divorce was finalized. Bernard's shoulders slumped as Maxwell switched to another recording. His fraudulent dealings with clients, each one documented meticulously. "I don't reset a certain timer every 24 hours, Maxwell said quietly. "All of this evidence goes directly to federal authorities. Every transaction, every hidden account, every crime. It's already set up." Bernard's eyes widened, his breath quickening. "You're bluffing," he whispered. Maxwell leaned in slightly, his gaze cold. "Try me." Bernard sank back into his chair, defeated, his hands trembling as he stared at the man he had once dismissed as mild and predictable. Maxwell turned to leave, pausing at the door. His voice was calm, measured, but final. "I may forgive many things, Bernard, but betrayal isn't one of them." Without another word, he walked out, leaving Bernard alone, crumbling under the weight of his own fear. The invitation arrived in crisp white envelopes, hand-delivered by a private courier. Each was addressed formally to Vivian, Natalie, and Preston Donovan, marked as an urgent request to attend a settlement discussion at the Grand Crest Hotel downtown. The letter promised a resolution to the ongoing financial disputes and hinted at the possibility of avoiding further legal action. Desperate and cornered, the three agreed without hesitation. Vivian arrived first, dressed impeccably despite the stress that had hollowed her features over the past weeks. Natalie followed, her sharp suit pressed perfectly, though her expression betrayed sleepless nights. Preston trailed behind, unshaven and jittery, his usual cocky confidence replaced by exhaustion. The hotel's grand conference room was lined with chairs, a large table dominating the center. But instead of attorneys or a mediator, reporters filled the space, their cameras trained on the entrance as the three walked in. Bright flashes erupted immediately. Federal investigators stood near the walls, quietly observing, clipboards in hand. The Donovans froze in shock, their confusion quickly turning to panic as they realized this was no settlement meeting. "What is this?" Vivian demanded, spinning toward a man wearing an investigator's badge. No one answered. Instead, the lights dimmed and a projector flickered to life at the front of the room. On the screen appeared the first of many files, scanned documents, emails, and financial records. A bold heading flashed: Vivian Donovan client account manipulation and fraudulent transfers. The details were meticulous, every transfer traced, every account number visible. Reporters scribbled notes furiously as photos of Vivian's signature on unauthorized documents filled the screen. "Turn that off," Vivian snapped, but her voice was drowned out by the next slide. Preston Donovan, corporate embezzlement and misappropriation of funds. Images of Preston's bank statements followed, alongside charts highlighting the exact amounts siphoned from his employer's accounts. His face drained of color as he stared at the evidence, each page stamped with official company verification. Natalie's name appeared last, in bold letters that seemed to hang in the silence. Natalie Donovan, legal ethics violations and suppression of evidence. The projector showed internal court memos, case transcripts, and emails confirming that she had deliberately withheld exculpatory evidence to secure high-profile convictions. Gasps rippled through the room as Natalie's once pristine reputation unraveled in front of dozens of cameras. Vivian tried to leave, but two hotel security officers, privately hired by Maxwell, blocked the doorway. "You can't hold us here," Natalie said sharply, her voice rising, but no one moved to stop the presentation. The projector screen went black for a moment before a familiar voice filled the room. Maxwell Donovan's face appeared, calm and composed in a pre-recorded video. He wore the same suit from his retirement party, the Mont Blanc pen visible in his breast pocket. "My retirement dinner," Maxwell's voice began, steady and measured. "My wife and children handed me divorce papers. My pension is ours," they said. "You get nothing." My daughter laughed, congratulating me on 40 years of wasting my life. I nodded, took out my pen, and signed everything. Understood, I told them. The room was silent except for Maxwell's voice. What they didn't know was that I had been preparing for that moment for 15 years. Every signature that night was the last thing I ever planned to give them. While they schemed, I documented. While they plotted, I built walls they could never climb. Betrayal, you see, has a way of revealing who people really are. And now, everyone knows exactly who they are. The video ended with a single phrase on the screen. The game is over. The projector powered down, leaving Vivian, Natalie, and Preston standing frozen as cameras flashed relentlessly. Reporters shouted questions, investigators stepped forward with official documents, and for the first time, the Donovans realized there was no escape. Maxwell Donovan never appeared in person. He didn't need to. His justice had already been delivered. The fallout unfolded quickly and without mercy. Vivian Donovan, once admired in Portland's social circles, was formally indicted on multiple counts of financial fraud. Her name, once associated with charity galas and high-expense real estate ventures, now appeared in every headline alongside words like corruption and deception. She tried to maintain her composure in court, but the evidence Maxwell had handed over left no room for denial. Her friends distanced themselves almost immediately, invitations dried up, and by the time she posted bail, the life she had worked so hard to maintain was already gone. Preston faced his own reckoning. After weeks of trying to negotiate his way out of criminal charges, he accepted a plea deal, 5 years in a state prison, reduced only because he agreed to cooperate fully with investigators. The smug, careless man who once mocked his father at the retirement party now appeared gaunt and defeated during his sentencing, his expensive suit hanging loosely on his frame. His company released a statement denouncing his actions, ensuring no future employer would ever trust him again. Natalie Donovan, once a rising star in Portland's legal world, was permanently disbarred. The state bar's decision was unanimous after the panel reviewed the detailed files Maxwell had provided. She stood in silence as the judgment was read, her usual sharp retorts gone. Within weeks, law firms she had worked with cut ties, and colleagues who once sought her advice now avoided her entirely. By the time the story faded from the front pages, Natalie was working as a hostess at an upscale restaurant, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might recognize her. Bernard Holloway's fall was perhaps the most dramatic. Federal agents raided his office after the SEC uncovered years of fraudulent activity. Desperate to salvage what little remained of his life, Bernard turned state's evidence, implicating Vivian in several illegal financial maneuvers. Once known as a trusted financial advisor to Portland's elite, Bernard was now branded a traitor to his clients, his reputation destroyed even before his trial began. 6 months later, Maxwell Donovan sat under the shade of a palm tree on a quiet, private beach in Bali. The sun shimmered over turquoise waters, waves rolling gently onto the shore. He wore a simple linen shirt and sipped from a cold glass, his tablet resting nearby on a small wooden table. The news headlines occasionally flashed updates about his family's ongoing legal battles, but he barely glanced at them anymore. His phone buzzed on the table. The secure line displayed his brother's name. Maxwell answered with a calm, "Raymond." "They're facing sentencing next week," Raymond said. "Are you coming back for it?" Maxwell watched the waves for a long moment before replying. "No. I've given them enough of my life already." "Any regrets?" Raymond asked. Maxwell considered the question, letting the silence stretch before answering. "Only that I waited so long to see them for who they truly were." When the call ended, Maxwell opened his laptop one final time. A single program was still running, monitoring his former family's digital activity. His finger hovered over the delete key for a moment before he pressed it. The screen went blank, and for the first time in years, Maxwell felt truly free. Some betrayals try to take everything from you, but sometimes they leave you with exactly what you need.